Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 12th to 18th of April 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, Jean Deville. Before getting into this week's updates, I would like to send a special shout out to our good friends at GoTaikonauts and SpaceWatch.global, two excellent sources for space industry news. This week, we're going to bring some updates on China's civil space program and in particular their double 100 goal, a surprisingly blunt article about China's aviation supply chain. But first, Jean will brief us on some updates from CASIC and their propulsion technology.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
Jean, what is CASIC up to as it relates to propulsion this week?
Surely, yeah, let's talk about that. So this week, we saw an article that was published by the Science and Technology Daily, a Chinese newspaper, on a CASIC Institute completing a precooling technology validation test, which is really an essential technology for spaceplane propulsion. Now, before we really dig into this piece of news, let's bring up some points on what precooling technology actually is and why it's essential for the spaceplane. So just throwing in some quick definitions here, a spaceplane is a spacecraft that's able to maneuver like an airplane once it's significantly into the Earth's atmosphere by generating lift. But at the same time, it is able to operate in orbit like just any other spacecraft. And so one of the main differences between the spaceplane and the just ordinary rockets is that for the spaceplane, you can't really use traditional rocket propulsion. And so rocket propulsion being, you have a tank with the oxidizer on board and you have another tank with the fuel on board. So for the spaceplane, rocket propulsion is probably not efficient enough to make spaceplane works. And so you have to look at other technologies such as air-breathing propulsion. So the idea is you still have a tank with the fuel on board, but for the oxidizer, you're actually using the air that's coming in through the intake of the engine, right? And this isn't necessarily rocket science in the sense that, that's what Airbus and that's what Boeing is doing on their aircraft, right? But when you're using air-breathing propulsion technology at very high speeds, at hypersonic speeds, so rule of thumb is beyond Mach 5, what happens is you have these massive shock waves that form in the intake of the engine and which bring the temperature very high. We're reaching 4-digit temperatures, and normal engines and just materials that we use cannot sustain such a high temperature. And when you have such high temperatures that are reaching the compressor and the combustion chamber, well, what happens is you also have phenomenons where you have, molecular dissociation, and that brings the efficiency down, and the combustion just doesn't take place as you'd expect it to. And so for the spaceplane, which goes way beyond Mach 5, the issue here is really to be able to bring the temperature that's coming into the intake down at acceptable temperatures, and that is what a lot of these spaceplane projects are really focusing on to make this work. And so that's what precooling is. It's bringing these 4-digit temperatures down to potentially negative temperatures in just a fraction of a second. And so back to now the news article on CASIC. Apparently, CASIC's Third Academy's 31st Institute, which is an institute that's specialized in aerospace propulsion, they've been looking at precooling technology since June 2018. And in past conferences, they've also shown technology roadmaps where we see that they're developing this precooling technology from the late 2010s all the way up to the early mid-2020s. And then after that, they're planning a prototype of a 15-ton thrust and a 30-ton thrust combined cycle engine, which would then be integrated onto a 2-stage orbit spaceplane prototype. And so the latest test that was unveiled in the article basically brings down the temperature of the air in the intake at 1,000 degrees Celsius to minus 150 degrees Celsius in 0.01 seconds. That almost sounds like science fiction to me. And quote unquote, it's with the largest scale and largest airflow in China. So unfortunately, we don't really know what were the Mach speeds in the wind tunnel. We don't know what was the actual airflow. The Institute sort of, keeps that information secret. But anyway, it still looks like a massive technical milestone for the 31st Institute's so-called Yunlong engine, because that's the name of their combined cycle engine they're building. Now, definitely there's probably still a lot of research that is to be done on this type of engine for the Yunlong engine to actually one day, run operationally and see the day. Because as far as I know, there is no operational equivalent of such an engine anywhere else in the world that's operational. There's been a lot of research on this sort of engine, notably in the 60s and the 70s in the US, but that were abandoned due to costs and just the complexity of such an engine. There is currently a sort of an equivalent that's being developed by Reaction Engines Limited. In the UK, they're building the Sabre engine, which is to some extent very similar, although there are some differences as well. I think the Sabre is planned to power the Skylon spaceplane, which is a single stage to orbit, whereas Yunlong powers a two-stage to orbit spaceplane. And now, speaking of a two-stage to orbit spaceplane designed by CASIC, that probably reminds some of our viewers of a spaceplane called Tangyun that was announced in, I believe, 2016 or 2017 by CASIC, and which is a two-stage to orbit spaceplane, right? And so it seems that Yunlong looks like a very suitable candidate to power the Tangyun spaceplane developed by CASIC. But looking a little bit into the Chinese Space Force, it seems that a lot of Chinese space forumers disagree with that statement. I saw only one post where, the person mentioned that the Tangyun propulsion is based on very different technology compared to the Yunlong. Probably, I would guess, scramjet and rocket propulsion mixed together. And I think to some extent, they're definitely right. When you look at the timeline of the Tangyun, CASIC mentioned that they're expecting to have a first test flight of their prototype around 2025. Whereas when you look at the Yunlong timeline, we're looking more at a first prototype of an engine in the late 2020s. So that probably means that any first flight of a spaceplane with that engine would come after that. So that just thickens a little bit the plot around Chinese space planes. That probably suggests that there are two of them. I do not know. The Institute 31 is very secretive on what it is doing. There's not that much really substantial information in that article that we mentioned. Exciting project, but a lot of mystery.
Molecular dissociation. That's one that I wrote down. I'm going to have to circle back and get a little bit more. We could have an hour-long discussion on that topic, and I would still know nothing. But science fiction, indeed, as you mentioned earlier. This sounds like some pretty incredible stuff, just from the perspective of, what CASIC is doing in the potential, the very long-term space industry supply chain, I guess. And when I read this article, I was kind of I was impressed at the extent to which the idea of expanding into commercial space has really seemingly permeated quite deep into CASIC as a company. And I guess it sort of it's a reminder that these large-scale initiatives by these very, very big state-owned enterprises, so like when a $35 billion per year revenue company like CASIC says, we want to get into commercial space, and we're going to do it through these 5 big projects, the 5 clouds projects, you can tend to kind of think in overly simplistic ways, saying, CASIC is going to build a Tangyun, and perhaps not really be mindful of all of the very small technologies that would go into a Tangyun, as it were, or some other non-Tangyun spaceplane. So basically, just this again, the depth of commercial space, or just indeed very long-term non-commercial space activity in CASIC is impressive, and it kind of got me wondering. I know that over the last handful of years, the biggest, sort of most high-profile proponent of CASIC's commercial space push has been the former chairman, Gao Hongwei, who was the chairman of CASIC for most of the 2010s. And I found out a couple of months ago that he, in June of last year, he was he left from his chairman post. And it was a little bit... I had heard for a couple of years that that Gao Hongwei was planning on retiring, or that there was a transition plan to some extent, but the removal seemed rather sudden, and the press releases seemed very short. So I don't know, but basically it's interesting that Gao Hongwei, who is the sort of architect of CASIC's commercial space push initially has now been replaced. So it would be interesting to see whether CASIC's commercial space activities are sort of firmly well established enough to where they will continue to grow and it will continue to be a growth sector, or whether this new leadership by, as it turns out, a former CASC executive, Yuan Jie, is whether he has different plans for the CASIC group more generally. I guess my last point to mention is that it would seem that Gao Hongwei, the former chairman, was prescient in the sense that he was talking in the mid 2010s about how CASIC needs to get into commercial space and how this is a growth vertical for the company and that they can, they should get into this. And as it turns out, if you look at the investment into commercial space in China since then, if you look at the the relative success thus far of projects such as the Wuhan National Aerospace Industrial Base, where you have a rocket factory and a satellite factory that are pretty much built. It seems that again he was quite prescient, was former Chairman Gao. So yeah, nothing else from my side on the CASIC update. I do wonder whether Chairman Gao was a fan of 2001: A Space Odyssey back in his day, because he definitely he had some pretty radical commercial space ideas for CASIC. They're doing some cool stuff even in his absence. So I wish them luck. But John, if you don't have anything else on that, I guess we can move into the civil space program updates from the week.
Yep. Speaking of ambitious space projects, so another article that attracted our attention this week was an interview of Wu Weiren, who's the chief designer of China's lunar exploration program. And so he was interviewed by an official space industry media in China called China Space News, where he announced that China was aiming for the double 100 goal, 双百目标. So just 2 points here to explain a little bit what this is. Firstly, I want to say that China really likes a lot anniversaries that are linked to its modern history. So notably, the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 and the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And so very often when you have, round numbers, big numbers around these anniversaries, 60th, 70th anniversary, you have big events to celebrate this. And one such example, recent one, is in 2019, that was the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. We had this massive military parade in Tiananmen Square on National Day, and that happens every year. But in 2019, it was more massive than usual, and it was also an opportunity to showcase some space and some military technology during that parade. So you're probably seeing where I'm trying to go here. In 2049, that will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And so China apparently is planning to send scientific probes in what is usually considered as the boundaries of the Heliosphere, which is situated 100 astronomical units away from the Earth. So there you have it. You have 100 astronomical units on the 100th anniversary. That's called the double 100 objective. And this, the announcement of these probes is not really news in itself. We know that for a few years now, the Chinese are planning to send 2 probes into the vicinity of the Heliosphere, notably the head and the tail of the Heliosphere. And these probes are called the IHP, the Interstellar Heliosphere Probe. This is probably just a temporary name because we know that China quite often likes to name its space missions really at the last moment. So, for example, the Tianwen-1 Mars mission was named recently only, and previously it was called Huoxing-1, Yinhua-2. It had several names. And even the rover that's on board Tianwen-1 currently that's in orbit around Mars hasn't been named just yet. So probably the IHP name will change for these Heliosphere probes, and which bear also resemblance with the NASA Voyager probes. Overall here, just wrapping this point up, I think that we've seen China have a strong focus recently in past years on the moon, more recently on Mars. This will likely continue. But we can expect very ambitious space exploration missions from China in the coming years, I believe, beyond Mars into the solar system and even beyond that with the Heliosphere probes. We have notably, just to name 2 of them, there were plans for a probe called Ganda to visit Jupiter and one of its moons, Callisto. And there was also an asteroid sample return mission called Zhenghe being a famous explorer in Chinese history. And I think both missions, both Ganda and Zhenghe, if they're validated, they would be launched in the coming 4 or 5 years. So yeah, a lot of things to look forward to regarding space exploration in China to beyond Mars and the moon.
Big fan of the name Zhenghe. That takes me back to there was a book that was written probably 10 or 15 years ago called 1421, and the author had this kind of out there theory that Zheng He had somehow sailed to the western coast of North America with his treasure fleets back in the 70 years before Columbus. And it's possible, but it was there was I hope that the Zheng He space mission, I guess, reaches as far reaching and far out places as Zheng He did back in his day in relative terms. But I guess one other sort of civil space program update that is not necessarily directly related to the double 100 plan. An interview from Zhang Kejian, who's the head of the CNSA, and it was originally interviewed with Xinhua and then published in Xinhua Net. And not a whole lot of new information, but basically reaffirming a handful of points from the sort of the planning of the 5-year plan process and sort of what are the Chinese space the civil space program's goals during that time. So basically, Zhang Kejian mentioned that the CNSA is finalizing a sort of a plan for the 5-year plan period. And within that plan, there's a number of areas of emphasis. And again, these include a lot of the usual suspects, but still worth highlighting that, the 4th phase of the lunar exploration program, some interplanetary asteroid missions that John mentioned earlier, some heavy lift rockets, and continued development of reusable space transportation systems. So basically, again, a handful of usual suspect type of technologies. Zhang also referred to plans for a global communications, navigation, and Earth observation constellation during the 5-year plan. So again, they have very busy 5 years for the civil space sector in China. A lot of technologically ambitious projects coming up. So on the topic of China's technological ambitions and the next 5 years and beyond that, our last update of the week is a report that was it was an article written by the South China Morning Post here in Hong Kong that was summarizing a report that was published on the paper.cn. And just a very short disclaimer before getting into this news update. Neither Jean nor I have been able to find the original version of this report, which was again published on the paper.cn. We both had a look around the Chinese language version of the website, and after about probably 10 or 12 minutes of combined searching, could not find anything. So we are relying on a fairly in-depth summary of the report that was again published by the South China Morning Post. So getting back to this report, the report itself was published by the Development Research Center of Shanghai. It's a Shanghai government research center. And again, published by the paper.cn. It's a website that is owned by the Shanghai government. And the title of the SCMP story should be very clear as to what the report's conclusions were. And that was that China's aviation capabilities are stuck at the low end as military-civil fusion weighs on innovation. And I received from a friend of ours over at Go Taikonauts, and Jean received the same email of this report, and that was the subject line of the email. And I was like, wow, that is a brutal subject line. So what was the meaning here? What was the report about? So as mentioned, it was written by a development and research center of the Shanghai government, and basically the report was very frank about the weaknesses that China has right now in its aviation industry supply chain, and that's in particular for key technologies such as engines, airborne equipment, and new composite materials, this type of thing. The report also mentioned that China's airworthiness certification abilities are relatively weak and that they cannot be fully recognized internationally in the short term. And I quote a couple of those things, which we will make clear in the show notes what is a quote from the article. But basically, it brings up a handful of issues that we've highlighted on previous episodes of the Dongfang Hour, including things like military-civil fusion being a potential enabler of certain types of innovation, but also being a hindrance for certain types of innovation. You also have some allusion to the overly large influence of the state-owned enterprises and the impact that can have on innovation in some of these sectors. It also highlights an incomplete distribution mechanism of shared risks and benefits, which I think is kind of a reference to the kind of rent-seeking ability and the power of these SOEs in general. And so again, some pretty intense points and quite blunt in its assessment of the Chinese aviation supply chain more generally. And again, have not read the entire report, could not find the entire report, but my feeling is that this is a report that is essentially a Shanghai government commissioned report in some way or another that is lobbying for increased sort of commercialization and increased devolution of, if not power, administrative decision-making authority, this kind of thing, to provincial or city governments. Because I think, you have an article that's talking about how, there's these weaknesses in the Chinese aviation supply chain. They can be worked out in a number of different ways. For example, the article mentions, I quote here, China's aerospace and aviation industry chain needs to be scientifically deployed, continuously expand the proportion of localized supply at the core level, take a solid step towards selective self-sufficiency, end quote. So, I mean, basically you have this saying that it's more of a call to action, saying our aviation supply chain is not sufficiently advanced and we need to do something about it. And again, implicitly, I think, and possibly explicitly, I again have not read the whole report. It seems like one of the conclusions is, give more power to the market, or at a minimum to the cities, to the provinces, etc. Just a couple of last points on my side, then I'll turn it over to Jean for your take. The article mentions that the report also cites some of Shanghai's efforts in aerospace and aviation and space more generally. So this included investing about 200 billion RMB into an industrial park focused on aviation manufacturing, which has plans for 200 billion additional RMB of economic activity by 2035. So it's fairly large efforts within Shanghai to develop their aviation manufacturing sector. And we've also, we see just some additional discussion about what Shanghai has done in some of these other industries. So I think overall it's a surprisingly blunt report. I think that, again, the Shanghai government, it takes some degree of confidence to be so directly critical of sort of the way that the industrial base has been developed in China, and some of the stakeholders in that ecosystem who are sort of implicitly harming innovation and harming self-sufficiency. Like these are pretty serious charges to bring, I think, in a country that's trying to become highly self-sufficient. So Sean, anything from your side on this article?
I definitely agree with your statement that well, first of all, I was really surprised also by the openness, or you can say the bluntness of this report. Usually the media and the government officials, they're usually praising the Chinese civil aviation program and how China is just manufacturing its own indigenous aircraft. And so, that does not have the same ring as this report. And also agree with your statement here that this report was probably targeted at more high-ranking Chinese officials and for decision-making purposes. And that's probably one of the reasons why this report was not as easy to find in the Chinese media. And I think that as U.S. Export restrictions grow on aerospace equipment, and we've seen that happen in the past, in recent months, and you can notably check out some of the Dongfang Hour episodes from December or January. China will undoubtedly look increasingly to make its own commercial aircraft end to end, and this is not actually something that dates back to the Trump administration. I mean, even before that, there's a strategy called Made in China 2025, which was published in 2015. And already back then, in one of the 10 priority industries where China was planning to become, to play a leadership role by 2025, was the civil aviation industry. So I mean, this sort of report that we've seen by the Shanghai government, I think these are one of the reports that can help some of the Chinese decision makers make the right decisions in order to nurture a homegrown aerospace industry.
For sure. And I don't know if you just heard that. I found an episode here of the Dongfang Hour on my side, and it started playing because I wanted to get back to the episode where we had mentioned the report from CSIS that takes a very similar take on the Chinese aviation supply chain, which I found is the episode from the 7th to 13th of December of last year. But I didn't necessarily think of that when reading the SCMP article, but just came to mind now was a lot of the same takeaways as the U.S. Center for Strategic and International Studies article from last year. So that could be another, I guess another place to go for more information on the supply chain. Yeah. So anything else from your side this week? Or are we all set?
I'm all good.
All right. Well, this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host, Jean Deville. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next week. Have a good day.
Thanks for watching. Bye.